Welcome to the Need to Know podcast from the Wilson Center, a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Always informative, nonpartisan, and relevant, we go beyond the headlines to understand the trend lines in foreign policy. Welcome back to another episode of Need to Know. I'm your host, John Milewski. Need to Know is a podcast produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The center is congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. And Need to Know is all of the above. This is a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. This week, we turn our attention to something that doesn't always make headlines, but has critical importance to the world's two largest economies, the U.S. and China, and that is agriculture. Or more specifically, we'll take a look at ag cooperation between the two countries that often find themselves at odds over a host of other issues. My guest today is Dr. Karen Mancl. Karen is a professor of food, agricultural, and biological engineering and water quality specialist at The Ohio State University. Karen is also a fellow with the Wilson Center's China Environment Program. Karen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
I am so happy to be talking to you today.
So I thought we could begin with a brief history lesson. How far back does this type of interaction between the two countries go?
Well, it went back farther than I actually knew. I knew that that the agricultural understanding was the first agreement that was signed when we were forming diplomatic relations with China. So that was signed in 1978, and then we actually signed the diplomatic relations in 1979. And we've been collaborating, continuously from 1978 up until just before COVID. So that particular arrangement I knew about. But it turns out that agricultural collaboration goes all the way back into the early 1970s. And that was negotiated by Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai when they were exploring during the Nixon administration ways for the United States to begin working with China and opening up our relationship with China. So in 1972, the United States and China signed developed the Shanghai Communique, was what it was called. And in that was added in, and the diplomats really thought it was something to add in, but didn't have a lot of, diplomatic significance, was, we can exchange, science and technology. And they added that into the Shanghai Communique. And right away, the first thing that the Chinese really wanted to learn more about was agriculture. So they quickly negotiated a series of exchanges, but because we didn't have diplomatic relations, we didn't have any embassies. So how are we going to orchestrate these scientific exchanges? So the National Academy of Sciences in the United States stepped up to do arrange for the scientists to move back and forth between the United States and China, and then a similar science academy in China, and those two groups orchestrated the exchanges.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So they organized a series of agricultural exchanges. There were 5 U.S. teams that were planned to go to China, and 7 Chinese teams to come to the United States.
So, Karen, you say that China immediately expressed an interest in agriculture. Was this driven by just practical needs, a lot of people to feed, what we might today call food security?
Yes, indeed. I mean, at the time, China had just under 1 billion people in population, and they could feed themselves. Which was one of the first things that the American scientists, when they went to China, were surprised to discover, was how productive Chinese agriculture was. But the population was continuing to grow, and they were projecting into the future. They were able to keep up, but they were projecting into the future that we're going to have to continue to expand our agriculture. And China now has 1.4 billion people, so the population has expanded, and their agriculture has, grown and modernized.
So is this a partnership that has worked for both sides? What have been the benefits?
Extremely well. So one
great.
of the things that I've been doing here at the Wilson Center was to evaluate this program. This agricultural exchange that started in the 70s had 50 Americans that went to China and about 70 or so Chinese that came to the United States. But then once the agricultural understanding was signed in 1978 and through the past the mid 20 teens, 2,100 agricultural scientists from the United States traveled to China, and about an equal number traveled in the United States. Well, what was the impact of that program? So that's been the focus of my fellowship here at the Wilson Center. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I learned was that we obviously learned a tremendous amount from each other about agriculture. So when you send a bunch of scientists back and forth, they learn stuff.
So things like how to do a better job in dealing with soil or crops.
Some of the things that the Americans learned from the Chinese, where they were the experts, was in insect control. China had pretty sophisticated biological control of insects, not using pesticides, because their agriculture was so old and developed and they didn't have access to pesticides until recently. So they had a great deal of knowledge on insect control. So that was actually the first exchange of Chinese scientists coming to the United States was on insect control. And the second group from the United States that went to China was on insect control. That was something that we wanted to learn about. Also, the Chinese were real experts on multiple crops per year. So they would grow 2 to 3 crops per year, where in the United States we pretty much grow 1 crop per year. So the American scientists were fascinated with this particular agricultural management approach. And the third area that they were learning a lot about was the use of plastic in agriculture. The Chinese in the 1970s were already using plastic to augment and to support agriculture, to make little plastic greenhouses, and use it as plastic mulch to preserve water, to keep water from evaporating from the soil, and to reduce weed growth. We weren't doing that in the United States yet. So those were some of the early things that they learned. And then they also learned a lot about animal husbandry and how the Chinese were raising animals, which was quite sophisticated. And they learned a lot about animal agriculture by going to China and learning about what they were doing in China.
Take me to the current situation. Have things lagged behind because of other tensions between the U.S. and China? Are we keeping up? Are there pending bits of legislation that we need to move on? What's the current status of this level of cooperation?
Okay, well, one of the big things that happened from the Shanghai Communique was it opened up trade between the United States and China. In the early 70s, we had zero trade with China. And that was really residue from the Korean War. That's where we really shut down trade with China. So immediately, right after the Shanghai Communique, trade just shot up like crazy, and the 80% of the trade from the United States to China was agricultural trade. So we were sending grain to China, and it went from zero to $2 billion within a couple of years. So it really opened up a market for American farmers. And that has just been on a steady increase all along. China is our biggest market. And in the United States, we have abundance in agriculture. We can grow much more than we need. So agricultural products are exported from the United States and really help with our balance of trade. And our biggest trading partner in agriculture is with China. But during the around 2017, 2018, we started to have trade tensions with China. And one of the outcomes of that was a problem with agricultural trade. It started to interfere with agricultural trade. So China started looking for other places to buy the things they were buying from the United States. We had set up all the infrastructure to ship primarily soybeans to China. That's our biggest export to China. And they started looking to where to buy soybeans somewhere else. So now Brazil is the biggest supplier of soybeans to China. So we lost a big part of our market. We've gotten some of it back. We also ship other grains and other food and other animal products to China, but it has suffered. And the Chinese are trying to diversify because reliance too much on just the United States as their supplier didn't work well for them. So that was a loss for us and a loss for U.S. agriculture. The other big policy element in all this is the Science and Technology Agreement. When Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping signed diplomatic relations between the two countries, the first thing they signed was the Science and Technology Agreement. And that set up this free flow of opportunities for scientists from the United States and China to collaborate and to travel back and forth, and for students to come to the United States to study, and for students in the United States to study in China. And that was all set up through the Science and Technology Agreement. Well, the Science and Technology Agreement has expired, and it's now on its second 6-month extension. So that's really been quite chilling in terms of having industry and universities moving back and forth and collaborating, and that's been quite chilling. So it's hopeful that we'll be able to get that signed soon and reinstate that particular collaboration.
Karen, one thing I've learned from both you and our colleague Jennifer Turner is that there are opportunities here related to climate change. Could you talk about cooperation in that regard, and what are the technologies in play that could have an impact?
So Dr. Turner here, the director of the China Environment Forum, and I have been collaborating for several years on rural environmental issues in China. And climate change and agriculture has a great opportunity for collaboration and to find win-win solutions. Because of all the areas that, people are concerned about competition between the United States and China, but we do not compete in agriculture. That's one area where we do not compete. So it's really a great opportunity to collaborate. And we both are food superpowers, and that we produce enormous amounts of food to feed so many people on the planet, and have quite the intellectual capacity in both countries to address big problems like climate change. So collaboration makes a lot of sense. Also, we have an opportunity to learn a lot from China because their agriculture is very different from ours. The size of their farms, the structure of their agricultural system, and the way they grow things is different from the United States. So we can inspire each other because we try different things. Our governments are different, so we adopt different types of policies. So we can, try things out and really gain inspiration from each other. So the three areas Dr. Turner and I have really identified that shows a lot of potential where we don't compete and could collaborate is in soil and soil conservation, because soil has the ability to sequester and store enormous amounts of carbon. So by adopting soil conservation practices, we can remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the soil. The United States is an early adopter in soil conservation. About 30% of our land area is now in conservation practices. China is just learning how to do soil conservation practices. They only have about 5% of their land area. So we have, the opportunity to collaborate and learn from each other. A second area where we can collaborate is in rice. Rice is a crop of all the different grains and all the different crops. Rice emits the greatest amount of greenhouse gases in the form of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. Rice also emits nitrous oxide, and that's 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So those two greenhouse gases, if you can mitigate them and by changing management practices in rice growing, it can have a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. The United States grows rice, and we grow about 4 million tons a year, but the Chinese outstrip everybody. They're the biggest rice producers on the planet. So we have the opportunity to share our research and look at our different management practices and learn how we could continue to grow rice, because it's such an important staple, but do so in ways that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the third and last area that we've identified is in food waste. The United States and China are winners on the food waste scale. We waste a lot of food in both of our countries because our countries are both so big, and the per capita wastage is quite high. So when food is grown, we put in a lot of inputs and energy and fuel and emit greenhouse gases in the production of food that's not, if it's not even eaten and starts to decompose, as it's rotting, it's emitting greenhouse gases. So about a third of the food on the planet that's grown is never eaten. So if we can reduce food waste, we would have more food available for people and for animals in terms of animal feed, but and also at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an area where we can share expertise, policies, practices to reduce emissions.
I need to linger on that number for a second. A third of the food grown is never eaten. It's stunning. We're almost out of time, Karen, and I want to ask you a final thing about your upcoming trip to China. We've talked about Jennifer Turner. You and she will be headed to the People's Republic. What's on the agenda?
So I'm going to be speaking at the U.S.-China Agricultural Roundtable that's sponsored by the U.S. Heartland China Association. And Jennifer is also presenting at that conference, so we're both presenting. It has three parts to it. One part is looking at agricultural industry, and so there are going to be many people from the United States traveling to China in the ag industry, and there's going to be a program and tour in Shandong province, which is one of the top ag provinces in the country where I do a lot of work when I'm there. So I'm very excited to be returning to Shandong province. And then we're going to travel to Beijing, and there'll be an ag education summit, and we're both speaking at a ag think tank summit. So those are our major reasons for going. And while we're there, we'll have an opportunity to catch up with a lot of our colleagues that we've only seen on Zoom for the past few years, and we'll get a chance to see them in person.
Well, glad to hear it. Godspeed. Thank you for joining us today. Good luck on the trip. Our guest has been Dr. Karen Mancl. For those of you interested in learning more, you can visit wilsoncenter.org. If you use the program tab at the top of the homepage, you can visit the China Environment Forum, see work from Karen, Jennifer, and others. We'll be back with another episode of Need to Know soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thank you for your time and interest.